How long does it take to get a white belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? This question's a little more complicated than you may think. Of course, there is the actual initial belt that you get when you sign up at a gym or academy, but you don't just get that when you're born, right? You first have to learn about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You have to know at least a little bit what it is, and then you have to know that there's a gym or academy close to you, and then you have to be motivated enough to go in there. And this process can take a really long time. It can be something that people debate about in their minds. I've heard stories of people who would know that they want to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They would drive up to the gym and they would sit in the parking lot. Nope, can't do it. And they would drive away and go home. And then it took them weeks to build up the courage to go into the gym. I'm glad they eventually made it in. For me, what happened, the first time I heard about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was about a year before I ever tried it, and it was from my mom. She was like, hey, here's this thing called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And it was something I maybe was gonna try, but it never ended up working out. But it took one of my friends to, of course, when you're 16, 17 years old, your friends make much more of an impact on you than your mom. But, he was also willing to carpool with me there, and I ended up going, and I liked the class. So it took me about a year to decide that I wanted to go. And I kind of sort of knew a little bit about what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was, but I had nothing going on, and I was like, sure, why not? Let's go try it out. And I showed up, and I wasn't given a white belt on that very first day. I was actually given normal street clothes. So in order to get my white belt, I had to go into the gym, and it took me, let's say about 2 weeks to actually get my white belt. During that time, I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, so I didn't actually have a white belt. And some schools actually have an official program. I know a lot of the Gracie schools will put people through a month-long period where they're not allowed to spar and they learn the fundamentals before. I'm not sure if they give them white belt, but that's when they officially get their white belt. But then you're not done, right? Because you have the white belt, but in order to complete the white belt, most gyms will give you 4 stripes. So how long does it take you to go from a 0-stripe white belt to a 4-stripe white belt? It's going to be different for every gym and every instructor, but I would say in general, the first stripe you're going to get in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is one that's going to come, I would say, relatively quick in the grand scheme of things. Generally, it's going to be after you've completed about a month to 2 months, maybe 3 of class, and you've showed up pretty consistently, and you've learned some stuff. You know a few things. Definitely don't have to know them well as a 1-stripe white belt, but you're just generally a little bit more aware, and you could do a couple things. Maybe not against a fully resisting opponent, but maybe you're getting there. I'd say that takes probably ballpark a month and a half. So now you're a 1-stripe white belt. How long does it take to get you 2-stripe white belt? I would say this is where you're going to have to start to actually understand some stuff. Now, some gyms give out stripes to their white belts like it's candy, but I think for the most part, the difference between a 1-stripe white belt and a 2-stripe white belt is a 2-stripe white belt actually has some moves that they can do against a 0 to 1-stripe white belt in a live roll. And they don't have to do them well, but you have to start actually developing a feel for how to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a live situation. So then from 2 to 3 is basically up to the instructor. Well, first, how long does it take to get that 2nd stripe? I would say in general, it would take, this one's going to be a little bit longer than your first one, because the first one's sort of like a pep, like a pat on the back, like, hey, let's get you going. The 2nd stripe is probably going to come another 3 to 4 months, depending on how consistently you train after that 1st stripe. The 3rd and the 4th stripe on the white belt are going to be really what's going to separate most white belts. And if you've seen my videos on the great filters of jiu-jitsu, this is kind of where they come in, from people who drop out before blue. And I think in order to get your 3rd and 4th stripe, this is where you have to start to go from someone who doesn't really know anything to an almost intermediate player, which is what a blue belt is. So between the third and the fourth stripe, I'm going to lump these two together because it's very, very subjective. You're basically going from someone who doesn't know anything to someone who's kind of aware and is like, all right, to like you're the top heap of the white belt pile. And this is a very special place to be when it comes to rank in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because some people have spent 2 years in total time to go from 0 to 4 stripe. Now, everyone has different spacing between their stripes and their belts and all this, but it's not uncommon to have a year and a half of total time before you have that fourth stripe, the third and the fourth stripe. They could come whenever. But at that point, you are pretty decent at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You're pushing the point where if someone has not trained, you could most likely tap them out like 95 out of 100 times if they're pretty equivalent to you before you started training, like same weight, et cetera, et cetera. But you're still a white belt. And so when you tell people that you're a white belt, it's like, at least for me, when I was a 3, 4 stripe white belt, I wanted nothing more than to have my blue belt. But you got to be patient, and honestly, don't rush to the next belt because it is very fun to be that fourth stripe white belt. And it's fun because you're actually pretty good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but you're, I think, allowed to make mistakes without pressure. Now, you could just literally be the guy who's so chill and never puts any pressure on himself or anything whatsoever. But I think it's kind of natural and it's a human instinct to, once you get that blue belt, put a little bit higher expectations on yourself. But when you're still a white belt, you could be pretty good in some instances if you're a fourth stripe white belt. You've been training for like 2 years, but you're still a white belt. So if you mess something up, you sorry, coach. I'm just a white belt. Don't expect too much of me. So I'd say that's about how long it takes to get a white belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.